Hello, it is Mr. Blake, and I am making this recording in the event that you were out Monday and you weren't here for our density and distribution talk in AP Human today. It's pretty straightforward and simple, so this is going to be relatively short. I'm just going to hit the high points. But when we're looking at density of populations, there's a couple of ways that you might see a question phrased using different types of density. When we're talking about density, in most cases, what we're looking at is how many things are in a square mile of something, right? Or a square kilometer or something. So you're counting and getting an average. So what you do is you do a count of, let's say, humans in a particular region, however many there are. Then you take the area of that region and you divide that into your human population. You're going to get some number per square mile. Okay, let's say. Now, it could be anything. It could be llamas. It could be whatever. You're counting something and then having that divided into the area that you're looking into. That gets you your density. And it could be a high number. It could be a low number. And that will tell you something about that object, whatever it is that you're looking at. In looking at humans, sometimes they'll use the term arithmetic density. And that sounds really official, doesn't it? That's exactly what I just described. So instead of just saying density, sometimes they'll say arithmetic density. And all that means is you're counting something and dividing it by the same area. So again, you're counting humans, getting an average number per square mile. So if you ever see arithmetic density, don't let it throw you. That's just an average density. That's it. You might see physiological density, and that is a little different. What you're doing here is you're taking the count of humans, but you're dividing it by the amount of arable land or farmland you have. So if your country has a whole lot of farmland and maybe a small population, that's not going to be a very big number. If you have a very large population and not have a whole lot of arable land or farmland, that number is going to be really, really high. And if you have a really high number in your physiological density, it means that either a lot of people are still farming, it could be, or it could be that you don't have a whole lot of arable land, and so you're probably importing your food from somewhere else. So think about like desert countries in the Middle East. Many of them don't have a whole lot of arable land. They have large millions of population, so they got to feed those people somehow. They're probably using as much of their arable land as they can for food, but they're probably importing most of the rest of it. Another density that you might see is agricultural density, and this is even weirder. It is the number of farmers you have divided or made average on the arable land that you have. So how many farmers do you have farming that arable land? And again, if it's a big number, it could be that you have quite a few people still in farming and you don't have a whole lot of arable land. That would be something like Egypt. Most of their farmland is just a mile or so to either side of the River Nile. And so there's this thin strip of arable land, and all their farmers are all concentrated on that area. So they have a very high, dense agricultural density in Egypt, but it's because they just don't have a whole lot of arable land. It could be that you have a very low number here. And that means that you could have a lot of arable land and not very many farmers. Think about the United States. We don't have a whole lot of farmers in the United States, but we still produce boatloads of food. We make all this food. And so how's that possible if we don't have that many farmers? And the answer is we make machines do all that. Think about all those big giant harvesters and stuff. We don't need a whole lot of farmers if we've got machines doing that work for us. So we have a very low agricultural density because we have a lot of arable land and not very many farmers, because that one farmer can harvest 10,000 acres of corn or soybeans or whatever that they're harvesting. So there are some maps for this. I highly recommend you look at them in the chapter and commit them to kind of memory, because you can learn a lot from those maps that I might ask questions about. So think about it that way. Distribution. We're looking at global distribution of populations. So I want you to think about, and there are maps for this too in chapter 2, about where do people live. in dense populations or in sparse populations. And the densest populations you're going to find are in the cities. And specifically, when we start looking at East Asia, think about your Japan, think about Korea, Taiwan, eastern parts of China. The populations are very, very dense because they are urbanized populations. They've been living in cities for a while. And so if you think about like Japan, Japan's mostly mountainous. And so there's very little flat land in Japan. So the population tends to concentrate in those flat land areas. I want you to think about other things that draw people to areas. What do we like? We like coastline. And so most of the Chinese population's on the East Coast rather than the west side of the country, because that's where the coastal side is. Think about climate. We like temperate zones. We like seasonal change. We like areas that have a lot of precipitation because we can more easily grow crops and water our people and stuff like that. Look at where rivers are. We tend to build our cities on rivers because there's a fresh water source there. So if you look at East Asia, there are certain countries that have very high dense populations, and that's because they've generally industrialized, lots of people in the cities, and it has the climate and topographical conditions we like. If you look at Southeast Asia and South Asia, let's say India and places like Vietnam, Thailand, and Burma, and places like that, you tend to have very high populations, very high density, but a lot of people are still farming. And so what you're looking at is small farms with lots of farmers living very close by to each other. And so they have dense populations, but it's not because they have really urbanized, although I'm not saying that they haven't got big cities and stuff. India certainly does. But a lot of their population is still living on these small farms, usually along rivers and stuff where they can get fresh water to water their crops. So those areas can have very dense populations, but they're not cities. They're actually farmland. So we do things different in different parts of the world. In North America, we have very dense populations along the northeast coast of the United States. Think about where New York and Philadelphia, Boston, and places like that. That is known as the Bosnawash Corridor, and about 80 million people live there. It's our densest part of the country. That's about where a third of our population lives, is along that area, along the eastern seaboard. So we have very dense populations there. But if you look at other parts of North America, the population is relatively sparse. We have agricultural land in the Great Plains region. People don't tend to live in the Rocky Mountains very much because it's mountainous. We don't like mountains. So think about where the distribution of populations are in the United States. If you look at Latin America or Africa, you'll see that there's often dense populations along the coast. West Africa in particular, right along the coastline, you'll see these big, giant cities. But if you go inland, it's very sparse populations and mostly agricultural. This is very similar to what you see in South America. If you look at where Buenos Aires is and Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, these are all big cities on the coast. But if you go into the interior of, let's say, Brazil, it's tropical rainforest. There's not a whole lot of people there. And so the population gets scarce or sparse as you go into the interior. And so that's the two things to think about. There's some great maps in this unit. I would look at them and study them and figure out what they are telling you and try to figure out why it is that people are living in some places and not in other places. That's a hint. I will see you hopefully on today or tomorrow and in class or not in Zoom. I hope you enjoyed this and I hope you find it useful.